What's up, Gravity Gang? It's your boy, the Gravity Guru. In my last video about if gravity was a repulsive force, a lot of you asked me, Gravity Guru, what would happen if gravity was doubled? And I mean a lot of you. Well, we are going to learn all about that. And without further ado, let's jump into the video. So, first things first, we gotta talk about what could make gravity doubled. So, the force of gravity here on Earth can be represented by this formula. It can be influenced by three moving parts. The first part being mass of the Earth. This variable sits at the top of the formula. So, if we doubled it, then the force of gravity would be doubled as well. However, this comes at a cost. If we want doubling the mass of the Earth to have any sort of impact on the force of gravity, then the size of the Earth would have to stay the same. Why? That brings us to our next topic, radius. You've probably noticed the radius variable sitting at the bottom of the fraction. The reason it's the denominator is because the bigger the radius, or the space between two objects, the weaker the force of gravity. Let's think about this practically. Let's say you have one planet and two astronauts. Now, we know the force of gravity between this guy and our planet is going to be greater than our force of gravity between this guy and our planet. So how is this practical? How can we use our learning to double the force of gravity? Well, essentially, after a couple quick calculations, it can be concluded that if somehow, some way, the radius of the Earth was divided by a factor of √2, then the force of gravity would essentially double. The third and final moving part of our formula is m2, or the mass of whatever object is being attracted by the Earth. Now, in order for all gravity on Earth to feel like it's doubled, we would need every object, person, or thing to have its mass doubled, but size stay the same, so that radius is not impacted. Kind of a weird thing to think about, but everything on Earth would magically have to become twice as dense. Now you're probably thinking, but Gravity Guru, you missed. The thing about this variable is that it's a constant, meaning that it's universally true for everything everywhere. Changing this would completely change the universe as we know it. And for right now, I'm going to leave that untouched. But comment down below if you think that maybe deserves a video of its own. Okay, so though these factors could make the force of gravity doubled, for the sake of this video, let's imagine that gravity magically doubled and that these factors were unchanged. Now that we've covered the background for this video, let's talk about what changes you could expect to see, starting with environment. So, as soon as gravity doubles, a very large change in our lives would be weather consciousness. Since the acceleration due to gravity would be double, rain, hail, and snow would all carry much more force upon impact. The elevated force that the weather would travel with would result in it being considered a much larger threat. If you thought snow days were bad before, they would be much worse in double gravity. Because everyday weather would be more of a concern, you could expect to see systems be put into place to account for this factor. For example, you might see sirens used to warn people of oncoming weather, similar to tornado sirens in Texas, Oklahoma, or Wisconsin. Also, roofs would need to be reinforced to account for these extreme weather conditions. Instead of our basic fiberglass shingles, we might use some type of metal like steel or aluminum. Another thing to consider would be the tides. The tides are influenced by gravity from the moon, and with it being so much closer because the force of gravity is doubled, you could expect to see some extreme high tides and some much lower low tides. This would result in flooding of cities near coastal shores, and could be potentially damaging to aquatic life. It would also have your uncle's favorite boat leaving his dock with the tide, which feels like a great segue into our next topic of discussion, transportation. With gravity being twice as strong, all vehicles would need to be redesigned. Because the force of gravity is doubled, the weight of everything on Earth is doubled as well. This would have a huge impact on vehicles and how they operate. Because my flawless transition was talking about your uncle's boat, it only feels appropriate to start with boats. Now, you're probably thinking that all boats would just sink right to the bottom, because they weigh twice as much. However, this isn't the case at all. Yes, it is true that the weight of boats is doubled, but you also need to think about how doubling the force of gravity affects the force of buoyancy as well. The force of buoyancy is equal to the density of the fluid times the submerged volume times the acceleration due to gravity. Now, because the first two factors are unchanged, and the formula is just basic multiplication, doubling the force of gravity would double the force of buoyancy of the water, meaning nothing would actually end up sinking. In reality, I believe the most prominent factor affecting boats would be the increased inertia experienced by them. Because boats would weigh twice as much, getting them started and stopped would be a much greater challenge than before. This means that boats would have to be equipped with much stronger engines, and likely modified propellers. Whew, that was a lot. Now let's talk about cars. For starters, the new weight of cars would be too much of a load for their current suspension. This excessive load is going to cause all current generation vehicles to just scrape along the ground when we try to drive. To combat this, all car companies would have to use stiffer springs in their newer models. Another huge factor affecting cars, similar to boats, would be their increased inertia. Because the cars weigh twice as much, starting and stopping them would be more of a challenge than before, simply because their brakes and engines were not designed to work under these severe conditions. To account for this, all cars would have to be equipped with stronger brakes and likely electric engines. Electric engines and their rapid acceleration is likely one of the best solutions to combating the initial inertia keeping them still. The last type of transportation I want to cover is trains. Trains, like cars and boats, would experience increased inertia. This would result in the same type of difficulty starting and stopping, meaning both their engines and brakes would need to be upgraded, similarly to cars. Additionally, because trains now weigh twice as much, all infrastructure meant to support them would need to be redesigned using stronger materials, as the new weight of trains would likely cause them to be damaged, which feels like a great transition into our next topic of discussion, infrastructure. So if we doubled the force of gravity on Earth, all objects would weigh twice as much. We know this, we understand this. How does this affect buildings? Well, this principle also applies to the materials that make up buildings. Because the supports that make up all infrastructure were made with the intention of holding loads at their regular weight, all infrastructure would be at risk of collapsing. To account for this instability, the foundation of all buildings and structures would need to be reinforced. This could be done using beams of a stronger material, reinforced concrete, thicker cables, you get the gist. Another thing to consider is the height of buildings. Because the supports of taller buildings already support more weight, double gravity would put these buildings at serious risk. To account for this, buildings would likely be much shorter. This would be done to avoid putting excess stress on supporting materials. These changes would be implemented as soon as possible. Jeez. Oh. It's a lot of physics. I need a break.
Wow, that was intense. But it has me thinking, how would double gravity affect sports?
Well, for starters, sports involving a ball, like football, soccer, or basketball, would be much harder because the ball now weighs twice as much. This means that you wouldn't be able to throw or kick as far as you used to. Also, games that involve hitting a ball, like tennis, ping pong, or baseball, would all put much more strain on your wrist as you try to hit the ball. To account for both of these factors, brands like Nike, Wilson's, or Adidas might make their balls out of a lighter weight material, like foam or a lightweight plastic. This would make throwing, kicking, and hitting balls closer to the way it is now. Additionally, sports involving moving your body, which is all of them, would be extremely difficult. Imagine playing a game of football with a weighted vest, except the vest weighs one of you. Sounds pretty tough, right? Another thing to consider is water sports. These would become much more dangerous as everybody now weighs twice as much. This would make drowning much more of a concern. Okay, but what about downhill sports like skiing or biking? Well, in both cases, you'd fly down the hill much quicker than you did before, because the force of gravity would be pulling you downhill with twice the acceleration it did before. All of these different factors would destroy the world record system, because in double gravity, people can do sports like skiing way better, but we'll never be able to come close to the high jump, swim, or running records. So I feel like we've covered a lot of the main topics for society and double gravity, but what about human biology? Okay, so some changes you could expect to see is that humans would develop more muscle and denser bones. We can support this hypothesis by examining how microgravity affects astronauts in space. It has been reported that the bones of astronauts lose between 1 and 1.5% of their density each month during their 4 to 6 month missions. Additionally, studies have shown that astronauts experience up to 20% loss of muscle mass on space flights lasting 5 to 11 days. So, we can infer that if lower gravity results in lower bone density and less muscle mass, then, likely, a higher force of gravity would result in humans experiencing an increase in both bone density and muscle mass. Another thing to consider is the average height for a human. According to NASA, while astronauts are in orbit, they can grow up to 3% taller during the time spent living in microgravity. Now, you might be thinking, ooh, it's because their bodies are adapting to space. No, really, it's just their spines decompressing. However, this does not take away from the fact that in double gravity, humans would be at least slightly shorter. Additionally, the human body would require a higher caloric intake in order to fuel our bigger muscles. Because the magnitude of your caloric maintenance is determined by your body weight, and we've already addressed that everybody would gain muscle mass, we can assume that your body would require more calories. Okay, so now that we've covered what changes you could see in your lifetime, what about generations from now? What changes could our grandkids see? What would they look like? Okay, so as difficult as it is to predict how humans would develop, we can base some of our assumptions on the principle that the new gravity would cause some type of natural selection, resulting in humans with traits that are best fit to live in double gravity. The first factor that comes to mind is good circulatory health. In double gravity, strong circulatory health is a must. Likely all of our great you get the point, great grandkids would have much better circulatory health compared to our own. As in order to stay alive, our hearts must fight against the force of gravity to get bloods to our brains and our muscles. Because the force of gravity is stronger, their circulatory systems would need to be stronger as well. Secondly, people would have much stronger chest and diaphragm muscles compared to our own. Because the force of gravity would be pulling your chest down so much harder than before, people would need to have much stronger chest muscles. These muscles would allow them to breathe and talk to other people. Another thing to consider is some people would have way bigger.
Dude, the video's 30 minutes long. Are you sure you want to watch this?
No, it's fine. We can watch something else.